Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I am Sarah Rosen-Mortel, and I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute and also of welcoming all of you who have joined us from across the country here, albeit virtually, to this really important discussion. So you'd think we'd have all learned how to do this by now, but let me do a few housekeeping notes. Our event, as always, is being recorded, and the recording and relevant links that we'll discuss will be posted online after the event on the event page. Live captions are turned on. If you want to turn them off, you can visit the live transcript icon on the bottom of your screen. We've automatically muted everyone for noise reasons, but you may and encouraged to type questions or comments into the questions box at any time, or you can email them to events@urban.org. We do share a link to a post-event survey, and we really appreciate that feedback. It helps us to make our programs better, and it also is good for everyone to know what you're thinking about, so we know what to do in the future. And please join the conversation on social media with Twitter, but if you use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, other people who are also tweeting about the event will see it. Today's discussion is about strategies and solutions to advance racial equity and ensure that homeownership is not just accessible, but also beneficial and sustainable for people of color. I can think of no topic that we work on more important, and I am so excited that we have the level of attention to equity in housing and to wealth equity that we have today. But our challenge is to seize this moment and do better by building what we learn in not just to a few boutique minority homeownership programs, as we used to do this in the past, but actually into the mainstream of our homeownership systems. And I think that we have the attention of important institutions to do that today. And to better inform this, the kind of work and progress that people are trying to make, and to understand what we're seeing in housing wealth and housing opportunity, the Urban Institute has spent more than a year analyzing homeownership, home value, and wealth gaps by race and ethnicity under what we've called our Wealth Equity Initiative that was generously funded by the Wells Fargo Foundation. And I am so grateful to Eileen Fitzgerald and her fabulous colleagues for their support on this important topic. Through this initiative, our research has explored how the benefits of homeownership accrue to households of color, and sometimes where they don't to the same degree they do to others. We've looked at future headship and homeownership rates by race and ethnicity, and the combined impact of homeownership and home value disparities across households of color collectively on wealth. Unfortunately, what we found is that absent significant policy and practice change, racial and ethnic homeownership rate gaps are going to remain wide in the coming decades. Talking about it does not necessarily mean that we are on a good path to make change. We've got to do more. And we've learned that closing the racial and ethnic homeownership rate gaps is not enough. We also need to ensure that homeowners of color are experiencing the same degree of benefit from homeownership that many white families have had over decades. Certainly my family is an amazing example of that. And yet too few have that benefit. So all of this means that there are real significant challenges in front of us, which is why we've brought together this important group of changemakers today. We're going to discuss and debate policy recommendations that the Urban Institute is offering through its work, as well as great ideas coming from our speakers, who bring great perspective from federal, state, and local policymaking, from the lending community, and other analysts. Today's conversation is going to start with remarks from HUD's Melody Taylor, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. And then after Melody speaks, we'll hear a presentation from urban scholars, Michael Neal and Kate Young, who've done a bunch of the important work I've described. They're going to share the results and the recommendations that have emerged from some of their findings on housing wealth gaps. And then we have just a terrific group who will be introduced by the moderator later, but let me just say my appreciation for those who are bringing their ideas and insights about policy solutions that state and local policymakers, as well as lenders, credit unions, and others can implement in collaboration with federal government and, importantly, community-based organizations, service providers, and other members of the industry to ensure homeownership is beneficial for everyone. So now I want to introduce Melody Taylor. Melody was appointed by HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge and the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, Susan Rice, to serve as the Executive Director of the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, otherwise known as PAVE. And I must say, I know that this is a high priority for the White House because I was at an event at Treasury yesterday where Susan Wright spoke about it again, as she has many times, how much stake they've put in this initiative. Currently, Melody serves as the Regional Director for the Mid-Atlantic Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD, known by many of us as FEGO. She serves the region in implementing programs and policies in all matters related to fair housing, economic opportunity, civil rights, and non-discrimination in the implementation of HUD programs. She's worked on fair housing for over 20 years and has an expansive civil rights career working in nonprofit, human rights, state, and federal agencies, including her work in program and policy development and strategic planning. So please join me in welcoming a perfect person to start this conversation off, Melody Taylor, and I look forward to hearing what comes ahead. Thanks for being here, Melody.
Great, and thank you, Sarah, for having me. It's an honor, and I'm excited about the great work that the Urban Institute is doing and that we're able to be partners in this effort. So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Secretary Fudge and HUD leadership, I want to thank the Urban Institute for holding today's conversation on strategies and solutions to advance racial equity and homeownership. Today, homeownership is the principal source of wealth for most American households, and properly setting a home's value is integral to household wealth creation. Disparities in wealth compound like interest rates. The disinvestment in Black and brown families across the country and throughout our history is still felt sharply today. In fact, the median Black American family has 13 cents for every $1 in wealth held by white families. It is for this reason that from their first days in the White House, the president and vice president centered our work around the guiding principle of equity. Under Secretary Fudge's leadership, HUD has made its mission to ensure that Americans with the greatest need of assistance, poor people and people of color, are the first to receive their fair share. We provided vital relief to families who fell behind as a result of the pandemic, distributed vaccines for COVID, helped millions of Americans remain in their homes during this public health crisis, and took bold action to improve the lives of communities of color. Responding to the president's September announcement on his commitment to using every tool available in government to produce more affordable housing supply as quickly as possible, HUD announced this past Monday that 23 mission-driven nonprofit organizations successfully purchased more than 800 mortgage notes through its recent HUD-held vacant loan sale. The administration has also put forth provisions in recent legislation seeking to bring about transformational change that communities desperately need. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, signed a month ago by the president, addresses replacement of lead pipes, provides affordable access to high-speed internet, allowing children the ability to learn remotely, and takes unprecedented steps to advance environmental justice. Additionally, items in the Build Back Better Act include provisions to create, preserve, and restore more than 1 million affordable homes, and proposes to help hundreds of thousands of Americans purchase their first homes that build a source of wealth they can pass down to their children and their children's children. And these are all critical investments. As of today, the homeownership gap between Black and white families is wider than it was in 1968, and when banks could still discriminate against borrowers based on the color of their skin. I want to repeat that. As of today, the homeownership gap between Black and white families is wider than it was in 1968. This is when banks could still discriminate against borrowers based on the color of their skin. That's a pretty powerful statement. And at the same time, enforcing the Fair Housing Act is as important today as it was in 1968 and remains a priority for this administration's efforts to affirmatively and comprehensively advance equity. As you likely know, and as Sarah mentioned earlier, in June, the president called on HUD in partnership with the Domestic Policy Council and other federal agencies to evaluate the cause, extent, and consequences of bias in the valuation of property. And this effort resulted in a Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Task Force, in which we call PAVE. The task force is charged with aligning enforcement activities, harmonizing regulatory action, and developing standards and guidance. I think we've all heard in the media, appraisal bias and discrimination in the home buying process remains a longstanding civil rights issue that continues to contribute to the disinvestment in communities of color nationwide. The president's foresight to mandate this initiative was timely and stimulated a call to action from the industry and advocacy alike. And as I speak to you, our task force members are aligning on key actions, commitments, and recommendations that we believe will create sweeping changes necessary to ensure equity and intergenerational wealth transference. With that being said, I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge and to thank the Urban Institute in speaking truth to power and carrying out its mission to open minds, shape decisions, and offer solutions through economic and social policy research. The work that you've done helps to support this task force and other federal agencies in being able to do our work. What we know is that there are many contributing factors in the property valuation process. However, we must collectively innovate around communities to ensure that where this investment has played a role, ways to trigger investment as a part of the solution. While we recognize the federal government has a critical role to play in overcoming and redressing this history of discrimination and in protecting against other forms of discrimination, we also know that the federal government cannot act alone. And as I close, I'd like to say that we want to continue to partner and collaborate to help move the needle on this critical issue. We also ask that you help individuals get help when they believe they're victims of racial bias in appraisals or other real estate related transactions. While the government will do its part to ensure public-facing information on this subject, it takes a village of individuals like you to point victims in the right direction. And second and lastly, we ask that you think about your organizational and personal carve-outs to drive forward equity embedding actions within your circles, because we believe the time to act is now. And so please know that the channels of communication are open and that we encourage you reach out to the organization. Again, I thank you for your leadership in hosting today's event and for continuing to be at the forefront on policy solutions and innovative ways to strengthen communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Taylor, for those frankly insightful and poignant comments. I think that they do well to set up, a discussion of some of the research results through what we have termed the body of work as being our Housing Wealth Equity Initiative. Again, as President Sarah has already mentioned, graciously funded by Eileen Fitzgerald and her team at Wells Fargo. The next slide, I think, starts off one of the key results from our most recent report. And to kind of walk through this analysis, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Young.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. One of the overarching themes of our research under the Wealth Equity Initiative has been a focus on ensuring that households of color are not only better equipped to achieve home ownership, but that they equitably benefit from home ownership as well. So along those lines, we have looked at household level equity. We've looked at the user cost of home ownership, which is an assessment of the benefits of home ownership relative to renting. And our latest research focuses on the total volume of primary residence housing wealth. As you can see here, our research demonstrates that Black and Hispanic households in particular own a disproportionately small share of primary residence housing wealth relative to their share of the total household population. That's especially true compared to white households who own a disproportionately large amount of the primary residence housing wealth, even relative to their majority status. Asian households also own a larger share of the housing wealth relative to their population share, but as you will see on the next slide, the reasons for that are somewhat more nuanced. Here we show that housing wealth disparities reflect the input of two key factors, homeownership rates and home values. What the chart on the left illustrates is that households of color, particularly Black and Hispanic households, are less likely to own a home to begin with. And the chart on the right shows that when Black and Hispanic households achieve home ownership, they tend to own lower valued homes on average. The combination of those two factors contributes to the disproportionately low share of housing wealth held by Black and Hispanic households. And for Asian households, their larger housing wealth share can be explained by the fact that while they are less likely to achieve home ownership, when they do achieve it, they typically own higher valued homes. Next slide, please. Another contributor to these disparities is majority and minority status. So white households own a majority of the housing wealth nationwide, in part because they represent a large majority of the population. Intuitively, what this means is that if Black households accounted for more of the population, they might account for more of the primary residence housing wealth as well. And so we address this theory by looking at jurisdictions where households of color represent a larger population share. On this slide, we show primary residence housing wealth in the city of Atlanta. White and Black households are roughly even shares of the population, yet white households hold nearly 3/4 of the housing wealth, which is more than quadruple the amount owned by Black households. And again, the charts on the right-hand side show the two key factors behind this disparity. You can see that in Atlanta, Black households have the lowest home ownership rate of any racial or ethnic group. And when they do own homes, those homes are on average lower value than their counterparts. And so with that, I will pass it back to Michael, who will share some of the analysis behind these findings, as well as our policy recommendations.
Yeah, the next slide, I think Kate kind of has illustrated, hopefully in her comments, the additional dimensionality with respect to racial and ethnic disparities in home ownership outcomes. And we also know that when we incorporate mortgage debt, that Black and Hispanic homeowners are also less likely to have they have less housing equity as well. But at the same time, and a key reason for why we pursued this line of analysis was to indicate that the disparities at the household level can be aggregated into inequities at the macro level. That is that lower home ownership rates combined with lower home values, particularly for Black and Hispanic homeowners, can suggest that across many cities of color, many cities where households of color account for a larger share of the population, that they actually wind up owning a significantly smaller share of the city's primary housing wealth. Again, two angles to this particular narrative, two key angles to this narrative, part of which are disparities in home ownership rates. And my colleagues, this chart is taken from research by my colleagues Lori Goodman and June Zhu, who projected home ownership rates by race and ethnicity into 2030 and into 2040. And what their research indicates is that absent key policy changes and significant policy reversals, that the racial and ethnic home ownership rate gaps are likely to persist. You can see that the white home ownership rate is represented by the Black squares, which over time are systematically above the multicolored columns. But at the same time, the next slide works through some of the research findings from our most recent report looking at disparities in home values. And we categorize them into a number of key buckets. including household characteristics, property characteristics, neighborhood characteristics. And what we found is that across many of these dimensions, Black and Hispanic homeowners in particular often found themselves sadly at a deficit. That is that they were, as homeowners, they were less likely to have incomes above $100,000. They were more likely to live in smaller homes. And they were also less likely to live in neighborhoods that they felt were near good transit or were in otherwise safe neighborhoods free of serious or petty crime. At the same time, I think part of what we found was that for Asian homeowners, on balance, they were more likely to have higher incomes above $100,000, more likely to live in new homes, and most importantly, were more likely to live in higher cost and often coastal neighborhoods. And when we control for that, those differences, declined quite dramatically. But at the same time, it's important to understand that many of the characteristics that I've already described are happening in concert with instances of racial discrimination. And these instances of racism not just affect the ability of households of color to achieve home ownership, but it can also limit home values. Things like redlining and targeted disinvestment, which have the effect of, again, not just limiting the ability to achieve home ownership, but also reducing asset prices for households of color and in neighborhoods of color. At the same time, as Director Taylor has already walked through, evidence of appraisal bias, also steering by real estate agents, discriminatory zoning practices that place neighborhoods of color adjacent to industrial sites, are all documented instances of racial discrimination that ultimately can reduce home values for homeowners of color. But on the next slide, we illustrate some key policy recommendations. And these recommendations reflect at least two things. The first one is the analytical work that helps to discipline and target the policies. But at the same time, it represents a number of local discussions and local meetings that we at Urban had across the country with key housing stakeholders. And many of the policy proposals stem out of a combination of those two pieces of information. For example, ways in which we can more equitably target workforce development in a way that increases income, particularly for Black and Hispanic households. We know that income is important, not just for your ability to achieve home ownership, but also for the type of, for the home values, for the value of the homes that you can ultimately purchase. Expanded programs for renovation assistance that help to allay inadequacies in the property of homes inhabited by Black and Hispanic homeowners. Our research suggests that Black and Hispanic homeowners are more likely to live in inadequate housing relative to their white homeowner counterparts. Also, ensuring geographically diffuse investments to ensure that capital flows are not concentrated in predominantly white neighborhoods. But amid all of this, eliminating instances of systemic racism and ensuring policies are racially sensitive is key to maximizing the benefits of this suite of tools. Keeping in mind that different areas are going to rely on a different set of tools in order to address the challenges that they face. One example of a racially sensitive tool is to ensure that policies are in the language that households, that is the native language of the households that are being targeted. The next slide just shows where you can find this work. Again, we not only produced a research report documenting many of these disparities, as well as a list of important policy recommendations, but we also created a data visualization that will help a user to compare housing wealth disparities, not just across race and ethnicity, but also across different cities around the country. And finally, let me end with what we think is an emerging challenge, and that is climate change. The next slide illustrates, and we certainly heard this in places around the country, of the importance and the cross-cutting nature that climate will have, specifically its potential impact on Black and Hispanic households. On the left-hand chart, we are just simply showing what we observe as a tick upward in average temperatures, giving credence to research suggesting that Black and Hispanic households are more likely to live in what we call urban heat islands. The right-hand chart indicates that at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, Black and Hispanic homeowners are more likely to live in inadequate housing. And there the interaction becomes clear. That is that intense heat could have the effect of further eroding the adequacy of housing, which could disproportionately affect Black and Hispanic homeowners, thereby reducing their home values. But at the same time, we also know that natural disasters such as flooding could also disproportionately hurt Black and Hispanic home buyers. In particular, one channel is by either raising rates on mortgages or totally eliminating access to mortgages through what has been known as blue lining. This would further reduce their ability to actually achieve homeownership. And this is an area that we hope to look into in the near future. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Yannicka Ratcliffe, the co-director of the Housing Finance Policy Center and a key thought leader in this area. Yannicka.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Caitlin. Such great information. I now have the pleasure of introducing our truly amazing panelists, and I'd like to invite you all to join me on screen. Thank you for joining us to offer your thoughts on the data presented and on national and local policy solutions and industry practices as well that can speak to the issues that Michael and Caitlin have outlined here. So I'm going to give short bios. These will not do justice to our speakers, so I encourage you all to visit our event page for their full bios. But in brief, first I'll introduce Chuck Bishop. Chuck serves as the head of diverse segments for Wells Fargo Home Lending, where he leads the business strategy for all production channels to increase opportunities for low to moderate income and multicultural homeowners and buyers. Next, Crystal Cornegay serves as Executive Director of Mass Housing, which lends over $1 billion annually to produce and preserve affordable rental housing and to create homeownership opportunities for low and moderate income borrowers. Next, Kathy Mann is President and CEO of Inclusive, a national network of credit unions devoted to promoting financial inclusion and equity by expanding access to capital in low-income communities and communities of color. You may know Kathy from her previous work leading the New York City Office of Financial Empowerment, the first such municipal office in the nation. And Mayor Jake Spano is mayor of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, where he has served as mayor since 2016. Mayor Spano serves on the National League of Cities Board of Directors and is also co-chair of the NLC's Race, Equity, and Leadership Council. We are so fortunate to have such inspiring leaders join us today, and I really look forward to the conversation. So let me get us started. Our researchers just laid out some of the major factors impacting the wide housing and wealth gap, as well as what that may mean for both national and local and policy practices. So I'm going to invite Crystal Cornegay and Mayor Spano first to speak to the policy solutions from your seats as state and local leaders. What needs to be on this list of solutions? And what have you tried locally that you feel has the potential to move the needle? Crystal, would you like to lead us off? And then Mayor, we'd love your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me be part of the panel. This is something we are very focused on in Massachusetts, thinking about how we narrow the racial homeownership gap. And one of the things that we've been focused on really as a state is about production and thinking about what are the tools in which we can do production, both of rental housing and homeownership housing in communities, particularly focused on communities of color, where people of color live and where they are likely to purchase. And so we have this program that we call Commonwealth Builder, which is really focused on thinking about, like I said, production, but also thinking about what that means in terms of the deed restrictions and how quickly wealth can be built using these subsidized homeownership opportunities. So, Mayor Spano?
Well, as they always say, don't ever follow a better comedian or a better act. And so I am in the unenviable position of following Crystal. For me, I would say that there's a couple things that really come through. But before I really get to that, I think that we need to take a step back and we need to acknowledge how we got to this place to begin with. And to acknowledge, especially for suburban communities like my own, the long-standing history of racist policies that set one group of folks ahead and held another group of folks back. And I'm talking, of course, specifically about the use of restrictive racial covenants on houses in suburban communities and the sort of blockbusting that took place. I bring it up because I have a racial covenant on my house, which I discovered here earlier this year, working with folks at the University of Minnesota, Kristen Delegard and her team that are running a program called Mapping Prejudice, where they're going through property deeds in our county and finding homes and properties that have these sorts of restrictive racial covenants. And what we found out was not only did my house have one, but my entire neighborhood had one. And in fact, much of my city was covered, and other suburban cities here in the Twin Cities area were covered by restrictive racial covenants, right? So when the starting gun was fired, a lot of us got to take off and start running. An entire other group of us were not only not allowed to run, but were substantively held back, right? And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, because as we're all aware, right, homeownership is the single greatest intergenerational wealth creator that this nation has ever seen. And so when you talk about the systemic issues of income inequity, it's no surprise that you can point to this as one of the main reasons. The second thing that I would say is, I'm always wary of telling one city or another, do this or do that. Here's this program or that program, because I don't know the contours of what housing might look like in Paducah, Kentucky, or El Paso, Texas. What I would say is that broadly, it is past time to act, right? And too often, I think for a lot of us, we see a problem of this magnitude, and we are looking for this silver bullet, this magic solution, not magic solution, but this perfect solution, maybe. And I have said this before, that allowing perfect to be the enemy of good is really the height of white privilege, right? Because I don't have to worry about if it's a perfect policy, I'm okay, right? I got my house, I'm building wealth. And so I think for us in St. Louis Park, what we have chosen to do is to do a lot of piloting of projects, small projects that we can sort of demonstrate, hey, this works, and then go to counties and states and ask for additional funding. We've done that. We're doing that now on the housing side. We've done that as we've looked at our policing systems and how we hire police. We've launched a lot of programs, pilot programs around equity relative to that. So more than picking one thing or the other, I would say it is act now. Don't be waiting for the perfect solution. Try something and see if it works, and make it better as you go.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask both of you, Crystal, you talked about supply as one piece of the puzzle. The mayor talked about how there are really many pieces of these puzzles. And so I wonder, have you started to see some things that are having effect, either in improving the supply that's available for first-time homebuyers of color or for closing the gaps in other ways, maybe the value gaps that Michael and Kay talked about, or other gaps that you observe.
No, thank you, Yannicki. I will say that when we think about this issue, we think about both and, right? And so we think about our housing supply shortage issue in terms of rental housing and homeownership, but also the homeownership gap is as much about people of color getting access to quality credit and lending products as it is about having homes to buy and places in which they can afford. And so we're thinking about what are the lending products that we can use, thinking about how we use DPA, but also not just down payment assistance, DPA, but also are there mortgage interest rate subsidies that can be provided. It's like just really thinking about how you make the mortgage affordable, not just in that moment, but for the long term and what that means. And if you're going to have a strategy about that, I would say it has to be both and to reiterate something that the mayor said, it's both and, but also a real focus on what's going on in your community. And so when we did the Commonwealth Builder program, we did that in a way in which we looked at data. Where are people of color purchasing? Where do people of color live? And just really focusing on what the data is telling us and going along with that, because this often can become an emotional issue. And so we really wanted to make sure we kept people focused on, well, it's not about what you feel or what you think or your anecdotes about what you see. Like, if we're going to address this issue, let's follow what the data is telling us.
Yeah, Crystal's right. The data is really, I think, really important. That's one of the things that we're trying to do better on is to be tracking data in a lot of different ways. I would point to maybe a few things to answer the question. First off, is something we've been doing since the 1970s in St. Louis Park is we have what's called a point of sale inspection program. So when someone sells their house, it's inspected by one of our inspectors and it needs to be brought up to code. Codes may change as the property owner, of course, owns the house, but what this has done in effect is it has ensured that our housing stock, which always has been more modest and affordable in St. Louis Park relative to our neighboring suburban communities, stayed in good condition, right? And so we saw less sort of tear downs. We saw less homes falling into disrepair because each time a house sold, it was brought into code a little bit at a time. And I actually think that has been one of the greatest things that has preserved affordability in our community. And I can, this, as I said, we've been doing this since the 70s, and I can take no credit for it whatsoever. Back in 2015, however, we did begin, we implemented an inclusionary affordable housing policy for rental property in our community that was tied to TIF, right? So when a developer asked for tax increment financing, we said, that's fine. Here's what we want in return. The reason I bring that up is because keeping rentals affordable allows people to more quickly save money for down payments to put towards ownership, should that be what they want to do. The last thing I'll sort of point to as a policy that we're launching that I'm interested in seeing how it does is we just launched a first generation home buyer program that is a prorated deferred loan over the course of 20 years. If the person stays in the house for 20 years, it's completely written off, but it's written off 5% a year over time that is targeted to help primarily Black and brown families get down payment assistance to get into a home. It's a very modest pilot, right? It's only $300,000 is what we've got right now, but we're going to see what we can do with that and see if there's interest in it. And then, as I said before, we may go back and look, to other partners to help augment that funding. I also think one other thing that I just want to sort of point out is for us as policymakers that's important is I do think that we oftentimes we start looking at very granular specific things, and we sometimes miss the bigger picture. And so I think it's important to know and think about things, for example, like I feel that special assessments for public infrastructure improvements that happen in front of someone's home or in their neighborhood, I believe that those are inherently discriminatory, because I use the street light down at the end of my block. I use the park that is around the corner from my home. I benefit from the water main that functions properly down the street from my house. Why is it that only my neighbor pays for that, right? So we as a city have really gone away from almost all special assessed infrastructure projects like that, because we feel that when you ask everyone to share in that cost equally, because they all equally benefit, I mean, we all benefit from it. Very few people complain about very, very small amounts in their property taxes, but when you hit them with a $10,000 bill for a new curb and gutter, that's different, right? And so when those investments are happening in neighborhoods that are more modest, those homes won't lose their value, right? Those neighborhoods stay strong and vibrant. They have beautiful parks just like all the other neighborhoods. So that's kind of another thing I think policymakers should just think at a high level about, are those sorts of things.
And the other thing I will say, one last thing I will say about for policymakers that we're beginning to explore is the sense of bravery or courageousness around addressing this issue, right? And so we definitely are, you know, when you're a policymaker, you're thinking about things that are good for all, how you can have sort of equal participation in whatever policy is. But, you know, we didn't get here, speaking to Mayor Spano again, we didn't get here because of policies that were good for all, right? We got here because of explicit government policies that were race conscious. And we're not going to get to a different place without explicit policies that are race conscious. And so we have to figure out in terms of we're making steps in that direction using proxies. I talked about Commonwealth Builder. Our proxy was really about geography. Some people have the proxy that's about first generation. But at some point, we're going to have to get to this place in which, if we're really going to address this issue, in which race, like you can't have a race conscious solution that doesn't actually include race in it. And so we're going to have to do that. And it's going to have to come from government in terms of policy making and about that. And so, you know, that's the path that we need to be on and all need to be open to.
Well, thank you both for this great start to the conversation. I really appreciate the way you show how the past and the present, how rental and home ownership, how planning and opportunity all fit together and all pieces of it. And I just love that last point about the role of resolve. And I appreciate both of you for your courage in this work and in the conversation today. So we also want to hear a little bit about the financing piece, which, as Crystal mentioned, is central to all of this. In our regional roundtables that Kate and Michael talked about, we discussed homeownership rate gap. We heard a lot about the multifaceted lending and credit issues and just discouraging experiences that households of color face. These issues can be around credit scoring, the dampening impact of other debt. I mean, I guess I don't need to tell you all this, but what I'd like to know, maybe Chuck, we can start with you as a large national lender. What do you see as the responsibility and the role of lenders in alleviating the housing wealth gap? And, you know, what can banks and lenders do to do a better job with outreach to alleviate some of these concerns?
All right, so thank you, first of all, to the Urban Institute for this opportunity to participate in this very important discussion. The topic of homeownership outcomes and the narrowing of the wealth gap is a critical national issue, and it's one that's receiving the highest level of focus and is a White House priority. The net worth disparity, and I think it was Melanie who mentioned earlier, is real. We see that African Americans families have a net worth of about $1,500 compared to non-Hispanic whites of about $125,000. We're seeing families of color who spend more than a third of their disposable income on housing, whereas non-minority families spend less than 25%. So we see a real challenge not only in the ownership, but in the overall financial health of the population. And that is very much tied to affordable housing. And let me expand on that caveat and say desirable affordable housing, because you've heard that theme also resonate through this conversation. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation representing Wells Fargo. And I absolutely feel that lenders have a role to play in assisting the correction of this gap. And when I say lenders, I mean banks as well as independent mortgage companies, because we often look at this lens solely in the eyes of one or the other. But it's not limited to us. It's limited to, all of us in the real estate professional industry, as well as policymakers, have a role to play. It's bigger than any one industry or any one line of business. And I think we first must acknowledge that we have a problem. We can't fix what we don't recognize is there and agree to address. So that's the first thing. And by virtue of the cross-section of the conversations we're having today, I think we are all on the same page. The work addressing this housing disparity and the financial health of our country is important now more than ever. We know that the Fair Housing Act was created, and it has not been the solution. It has been a tool, but it has not been a solution. And this gap, we feel like it isn't new. It's been one that's been burgeoning for a while. 2020 was a very dynamic year for our country, and the murder of George Floyd was a catalyst, so to speak, in much of the social unrest, and really, I think, highlighted the disparities. But this fix was needed long before that. And we recognize that. And so the question was, what can lenders do? Lenders have to lean in. While we can't effect housing prices, we can effect home ownership affordability. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do so. Back in 2016 and 2017 at Wells Fargo, we made $185 billion in commitments to increasing home ownership opportunities and purchases for African American and Hispanic homeowners. Not only did we make the commitment in increasing home ownership, we made those commitments in more than $15 million in support for HUD counseling agencies, because we feel like education is critical for sustainable home ownership. If we didn't learn anything else in 2020, we learned also that we've got to be prepared for disaster, we've got to be prepared for emergency. And sustainable home ownership is critically important. Attaining the house is one part of it, but maintaining the house and keeping the house is a critically important piece that we don't often talk about. And then we also made a commitment to increase the diversity of our sales force. We need to represent the markets and the communities we serve. We need to have representatives from those communities, be our sales agents, and be the outreach and the interface there. So you've heard a lot of talk about Eileen Fitzgerald, who runs our Wells Fargo Foundation. Her team has been phenomenal. And over the last 10 or so years, they've run a number of national down payment programs called Neighborhood Lift and Operation Lift. And through those programs, we've made over $500 million in down payment assistance available to help more than 25,000 families become homeowners. That's the kind of things that banks have to do. We have to lean in and invest in these communities for sustainable home ownership. And again, when we can put the down payment into these programs, we effect affordability, but we also help customers move in with immediate equity, which then starts to change the dynamic of their ultimate long-term growth as it relates to having financial health. We also work with industry partners. We work with government service entities, so Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, HUD. We work with HUD counseling agencies. We can't do it alone, and we recognize the need to be collaborative in our outreach and cross-functional in our engagement. We also have agreed to support through a $50 million contribution to the MDIs, so the Minority Depository Institutions. Those are minority-owned banks who already have connectivity in these communities and are working every day with their constituencies and their partners to make lending and banking come to reality in these communities. And we realize we can't be in every community, or we don't have the connections in those communities. So we want to be able to fund those entities that do and be supportive and collaborative to be able to have tentacles into those communities, to be able to support them and grow through that outreach. So I will tell you also that there was conversation about policy, and I saw in the Q&A a question that come up about, how do you reach out and where's the help to be done across multiple businesses? And, we work with the OCC through Operation Reach, and Operation Reach is across multiple banks, nonprofit intermediaries, CDFIs, and other in the affordable housing arena, because we have to come together as that cross-section collaborative to engage upon this. So the question was about, is there disparity in denials amongst ethnic minorities? And I don't want to jump ahead, so but I would say there absolutely is a difference in lending approvals amongst ethnic groups. There is a lot of data behind that, so I don't want to go into all the interpretations, because the HMDA Plus data tells you about LTVs and FICOs. So there are a bunch of things to read into that. But suffice it to say, there is work to be done to be able to have a more equitable rate of approvals and declines as it relates to customer segments. And the reality is that we have to lean in. So one of the work streams in Operation Reach is, how do we address the no? The no shouldn't be a no, but it should be a not now. And what does that not now mean? How do we course correct and bring people back into the fold? Because when a person of color hears a no, it has a very different meaning. It often means that, not a chance. Do I sign another lease? Do I spend that 3% I saved on something else? Is it an emotional piece? We want to eradicate those feelings and make it much more of a transition into not now, but here's how and here's when, and let's go on a very prescriptive path to recover and re-engage in this in a meaningful way. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm thankful for the conversation with my colleagues across the industry. We have a role to play, and we very much embrace our position as a national lender and want to make a difference in housing affordability, as well as access to housing for people of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, and I appreciate your illustrating the ways in which a large national player like Wells can lean in. Kathy, I'd love for you to weigh in on the role of CDFIs, community development credit unions, and particularly, those whose leadership reflects the communities they serve. Perhaps you could say more about the role for the MDIs, the minority depository institutions that Chuck mentioned, more relationship and lending that's coming from, closer to the community institutions such as these.
Absolutely. And thank you, Yannicka. Thanks to the Urban Institute for including me on this fabulous panel. I feel like I'm learning so much, and my head's going in multiple different directions as you all have been speaking about ways we can connect up to the different areas of work that you're talking about. So Inclusive is a network of community development and minority designated credit unions across the country. We have 425 members in 46 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And community development and minority designated credit unions have historically been filling gaps in their communities by providing capital and access to basic banking services, using relationship-based kind of risk management processes, relationship-based lending, to engage their members in the ability to kind of get access to safe, responsible, affordable credit. As financial cooperatives organized by and for their members, they're kind of both authentically connected and have the trust in their communities, but are also really uniquely positioned to kind of design and develop very customized products that meet the immediate needs and really address the gaps that they see across all credit lines. And this is particularly true in the mortgage space, where community development and MDI credit unions and banks, really they tend to create affordable, non-conforming mortgage products, oftentimes to sit in portfolio because they don't necessarily connect to secondary market products, but they're really designed with the borrowers in mind to make sure that they're getting people into homes, and perhaps more importantly, that people are succeeding in homeownership and being able to kind of really build wealth through that asset and pass it along through generations. That process, and oftentimes having to originate to hold in portfolio, is limited by the size of the institutions. And for many, and particularly Both community development and MDI credit unions have historically been sort of smaller institutions. In the case of credit unions, MDI credit unions that typically have asset sizes under $100 million. So there's a very quick, they're very quick to kind of tie up a good chunk of capital in there by only being able to do portfolio lending. So a lot of what we do at Inclusive is try to create secondary market options so that either we can purchase purchase mortgages to offload, that credit unions can then offload from their portfolio to continue their own lending locally. And then we really try to influence the marketplace to be able to better understand that these are some of the safest mortgages you could be making. When you're helping a homeowner get into a home for the first time and you have invested time and energy in working together alongside that homeowner, there's not a better risk profile that you could come up with, honestly. And that was borne out, throughout the financial crisis, of more than 10 years ago. Credit union and CDFI lending in the mortgage space had very few losses. And those losses usually happen years after some of those early losses. And it was never because of the way the products were designed. Those losses that did occur later on really resulted more as a result of people having job loss. But it's a critical recognition that we have to be creating products that are really responsive to not just the needs of individual home buyers, but also to the systemic issues that are going on in the communities where, particularly where MDIs are serving, MDI banks and credit unions, where there has been historic discrimination, where access to capital didn't exist for generations. And then when it came in the way of high cost subprime loans that were designed for people to fail. So what we think a lot about when we're designing our strategies around homeownership, and I think some of these strategies that could have a real policy implications, is how critical it is to provide supports for homeowners to build and improve credit, and recognizing that for many homeowners or potential home buyers of color, particularly African-American borrowers, there have been decades of predatory and high-cost lending that as a lender, you have to help people move out of. So credit profiles are often challenged by the access to very predatory, to the products that they have, which are often high cost and very predatory. I want to sort of echo Crystal's point about the importance of down payment assistance. As a community development lender or a community-based lender, both, I think, community banks and credit unions, as lenders, you often are not so familiar with all the different opportunities that might be available to your borrowers in front of you. So at Inclusive, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our member credit unions are connecting well to homeownership counseling organizations in their community, and that they're able to kind of make those partnerships happen so that all of the supports that might be available at the city level, at the county level, at the state level are that those lenders are aware of them and helping their borrowers access that. But that's not always possible to do. And so one of the things I think is going to be really important is to try to be thinking more, how do we kind of coordinate the delivery of down payment assistance programs so that there might be a way in which, lenders can really easily plug in some basic information on their borrowers and be able to figure out what supports they might be available to them. I think that would dramatically improve our ability to get people into the right products and the right supports to be able to get into to good affordable mortgages.
Right.
And lastly, there's a real need for kind of investment in technology. I'm just going to say this: community development lenders, it is relationship-based lending. So when we think about scaling, and we're sort of pushed towards, well, scalability is often delivered through technology. Technology options right now, automated underwriting, by and large, is designed for upper middle income borrowers. They're designed for predominantly white homeowner and home buyers. And they're not looking at sort of understanding different profiles that fall outside of a very narrow credit box. So we worry a lot. We do a lot of customized lending, and we worry as we try to scale and move into automated underwriting, we're going to move away from our market unless we're redesigning those tools to be baking in some of that character-based lending that is so essential, that's already, that currently is happening in community-based lenders. So we see a lot of opportunities, and I think there's a lot of, we're at a moment where there's a lot of resources that is both coming into community development lending institutions to help us scale. I think the way that we sort of position that will be critical to make sure that we're bringing our members and borrowers along with our institutions as they're growing.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. And Chuck, both of you. I think this is another case where we see the both the scale and the scope and the kind of reach and numbers and activities that Chuck was talking about, and then the CDCU's customized approach to doing this, and how they all have a place in the ecosystem, and how we need to try to figure out how to leverage it all. If I could, I'm going to move on to a couple other topics that came up in the research, and just sort of get your feedback on. We talked about the interplay. The research talks about the interplay of home ownership rate and home values that drive, and as Melody Taylor said so well, compound racial wealth gaps. And it seems like there could be some fundamental changes in communities of color, in how we value homes and how we invest in those neighborhoods. So I'd like to see if anyone any of the panelists would like to weigh on how we can improve the sort of the value side of the equation, both at the house level, but also the neighborhood and community level.
I'll just quickly mention, and I think I heard this discussed earlier, but the appraisal bias issue is a real challenge right now, as we're seeing homeowners of color receive lower valuations at times versus similar houses that are owned by non-minorities. And this is receiving national attention, and it's another one of those opportunities where there's a collaborative through Project Reach, where there's a work stream directly focused on this, and most lenders also have independent work streams in the space, because that valuation, again, is a challenge. We also see through the work that's been done through forbearance and other, the crisis we see coming out of the pandemic. So the health crisis has caused an issue that's very different than the first housing crisis. Years ago, we had people who walked away from homes where they maybe didn't have as much skin in the game, lower down payments or no down payments on some of these hybrid mortgages that didn't require down payment. Today, as it relates to sustainability and value, we want to be able to keep people in homes. There's equity in homes today. So there's a different risk when you have the potential of foreclosure. So the work that's been done either through policymakers or lenders around forbearance and homeownership sustainability, I think is critically important for keeping that wealth in these communities and in these households. And that work will play out to mean that we're making a real difference, a tangible difference in sustainability and keeping some of that financial health alive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Another point that came up in Michael and Kate's work was talking about climate risk, right? Not just, there are all these crises come along, economic crises, climate crises, and I think we're learning how to help households through them. But there's also this aspect of climate change that Michael talked about, which isn't a disaster so much as the incremental change, the increase perhaps in the cost of owning a home that may not be able to be as resilient to weather changes. And our research indicates that Black and Hispanic homeowners are more likely to live in housing in need of rehabilitation. We heard about how the mayor has been dealing with that, or how the history of the town has been dealing with keeping houses up in shape over years. So I wondered if there's anything else any of the rest of you have been thinking about with regard to the issue of climate change and climate drift.
But, I'll chime in here, for us, there's a lot of, so we passed the most aggressive climate action plan in the state of Minnesota a few years ago. And there's a lot of different prongs to that as we sort of have explored the transportation sector in particular. And now we're really pivoting over to buildings, both commercial, industrial, and residential. I would say there's a couple of pieces that we've tried to one that we're just trying out right now. And we had to actually get special legislation for this, but in the state of Minnesota, if you need safety upgrades to your house, like let's say a fire suppression system is required for your building, if you're in a commercial building, you can, there are programs where we can help front the cost of that, and then that gets put onto your property taxes over the course of a decade, right? So you're able to sort of pay that off over time. We actually got special legislation in this last session to allow the same thing for energy efficiency upgrades in residential property. So folks now are going to be able to put solar on their house, do geothermal, do what have you, and then pay that off over time, because that barrier to the cost, and even for somebody like myself who's explored the idea of solar on my property, that barrier to entry, that's a big piece, right, to sort of that keeps people out of that space. And so I think that looking at things like that, and then we subsidize programs. For example, our energy provider here is Xcel Energy, and they have what they call Home Energy Squad audits, where they will come to your house and they will do pressure testing on your house with all the windows and doors closed, and tell you what the thermal efficiency of your home is, and provide to you a set of recommendations of things that you can do. There's a cost associated with that. Well, we actually subsidize that for our homeowners, right? To sort of, at least what your best bang for your buck is. And interestingly enough, I lived in a house that was built in 1947, and I had them come, and I for sure thought they were going to say you should replace your windows, and they were like, no, you actually shouldn't. It's not worth it. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. Here are some other things that you could be doing that are more efficient. So that's another way that we try to make sure that we're lowering those opportunities, those barriers, I should say, for opportunities to be energy efficient with property.
Thank you. That's great.
Sorry, Kristen.
I would love to, we don't have time today, but I'm curious how equity plays into that. And I just wanted to put a little bookmark in that. We have some really rich questions in the Q&A. So let me pose the sort of one last question, and then one more round around the panelists, starting with Crystal and then Kathy, and then Chuck and Mayor can go last. Looking forward, our data shows that people of color will account for virtually all of the household formation nationwide by 2040. So I'm just curious, based on the conversation we're just starting to have, you can go back to those points as well, but I'd like to sort of hear people look ahead and tell me what we need to be doing, most of all, and what's on your mind with respect to that. Crystal?
I just want to put, this issue is huge, right? And when you look ahead, it gets even more daunting, right? It's not just about trying to address things that have happened in the past, but what does that mean in terms of a marketplace of home buyers over the next 20 years? And so we get ourselves into this place, particularly when we talk about people of color, in which we want a policy that's pristine. It has to have climate change. It has to address this. It has to do that. And I'm just saying, we are so far behind on this issue. Pick a thing and let's do all the things. We need all the things. There isn't one pill that we're going to take in which we're going to lose 50 pounds in 10 weeks. That's not going to happen. It took decades upon decades for us to get here. And so let's not pretend that we're going to make this historic investment of build back better and then things are going to be great in 10 years. It's not going to happen. And so if you care about this, then this is the long game, and you got to get into this for the long game, and you got to start somewhere, right? And so, use what you have, do what you can, start where you are. And that's what we're doing. right? And then you're going to learn stuff and then you're going to do some other thing. And don't be that person that's like, well, what about, climate change and the people of color in that neighborhood? Well, what about it? Like, you didn't care about it 2 weeks ago. And like, let's start there and like get people going in that place. And let's, get behind this thing. Kathy.
And to that point, I love it. It's like the 1,000 flowers bloom. All of it requires commitment. All of it's going to require investment. We do need to be investing in upgrading of the housing stock and the energy efficiency and the solar capability. We need to be reducing energy burdens. We need to be getting people into homes with responsible and affordable credit, pulling together packages of supports and subsidies to make sure they're successful in it. So I'm with you on that. Let's, we all need to pick our part of it and kind of start rowing together. And I love all the strategies that have been raised here. I was going to say on the appraisal point of before, we also need to engage regulators, because sometimes our institutions that want to be moving into the directions their communities need them to, they're pulled back by regulation in the appraisal space. That's been a real problem, but really across the board, our ability to get creative, we need kind of creativity in the frameworks in which we can operate as well, to really be driving forward this, each one of us taking our lane and making it happen. So I love that.
So Jan, I just add, real quickly, we're all in at Wells. We're really committed to being successful in this space. But I think there's opportunity for regulatory reform. The Community Reinvestment Act from 1977 speaks to lending in low and moderate income census tracts and to low and moderate income people. There's no reference to color or ethnicity. I think there's opportunity in the CRA reform to have a component that takes into consideration ethnicity. I think there's also the opportunity to expand CRA to include all lenders, not just banks, but the independent mortgage independent mortgage lenders as well, because we all have a role to play in ensuring that there's equitable access to credit and housing. So having some regulatory reform, I think, in that space would mean that there'd be more players who are held accountable for contributing to the success in this space.
Great points. Mayor, anything to add?
The beauty of going last is all the smart stuff has usually been said by that point. And this is particularly true in this case. I'll just say, like, it's one of the great things about being at the city level is that we have the flexibility. We've got more flexibility, right? We don't have to, and to Crystal's point, like, we don't have to have it perfect to be able to, run it out and sort of give it a try and see if it works and what have you. And so I would just encourage those folks who are here, whether if you are a policymaker or if you are engaged with policymakers, quite honestly, at least in this state, I want to say, like, it feels to me like all of the action is at the local level. It is not at the county level. It is not at the state level, and it is certainly not at the federal level. We look very, very hyper local to build momentum towards creating broader change, and that has been very successful here in this state. So we love it, though. If the feds and the state want to just like cut checks and give it to us to do stuff, we're more than happy to do that. And we have used, the ARPA monies and others to, in those ways. And so we just want to encourage that. But I would say if you're looking to make change, look local.
Thank you so much. So we heard about creativity, and we heard about courage, we heard about CRA, and we heard about cities. So I'll say 4 C's there from each of you. We really have some super interesting questions, and I'm almost not quite sure where to start. They're so good. Let's talk about down payment assistance. That's come up several times. It appears that DPA programs are annual programs that are funded for the same amount each year. Though costs seem to be increasing, property prices are increasing. Has there been discussion about increasing down payment awards to the same rate of house price increases or other big C changes in down payment assistance that could be most helpful?
I'll just add real quickly from my perspective. Down payment assistance programs that are typically governed by a municipality or a housing finance agency may be the same year over year because they're probably tied to some funding allocation. However, I would tell people you can layer down payment assistance programs. Many people don't understand that. They'll apply for one and think that's all. You can layer the down payment assistance programs, many together. You can also use lender credits and things like that to put on top of down payment assistance programs. So I would say make sure you know all your options. I would say find your money before you find your house. So that means connecting with a real estate professional or more importantly, a housing counseling agency. Even if you don't think you need the education component, it's typically the gateway to connectivity around resources available. I know the internet is a wonderful tool, but it gives us a false sense of security at times, thinking we know everything. So reach out to a professional housing counselor and really understand all those components and the way you can layer up to really have an impact to your LTV and your payment.
Great.
I want to say what Chuck said, definitely around layering and housing counseling. In Massachusetts, we are going to use some of our federal ARPA money to create a statewide DPA program. And we are going to be looking to increase that beyond what we traditionally do. But we're also looking to figure out what are the other barriers, right? And so DPA is easy, right? It's like, I'm just gonna write you a check, right? And that's easy and it's simple. But if we're gonna do that in a way in which we're talking about really narrowing the racial homeownership gap, what are the other barriers to racial homeownership, right? And so we, again, like go back to the data. And if some of the barriers have to do with, you could easily be a person of color engaged in the tech industry and be making six figures, but have no down payment and have some credit issues, right? It's like, because the way people of color get to where they get to is different, right? And so we shouldn't just be looking at AMI as the only thing. Like if you're gonna have, again, a race conscious program, then you gotta be thinking about what are the ways in which various racial and ethnic groups get to be at different AMIs. And so it's not just DPA, but how can you use DPA to help with other things that create barriers to homes? And so can you use some DPA as debt elimination, right? Like maybe you have some like credit issues in which you might be able to create that. And so we're really trying to think about broadly the focus again, doing all the things. It's not just DPA. It's like, what are the other things that keep people, and particularly people of color, out of homes?
You know, one of the things we've been noodling on a lot is trying to work with sources of down payment assistance that would allow you to put like a lock on it, you know, that where borrowers could, because there are so many borrowers who have, who may have a number of credit challenges that they need to deal with. And, you know, when working through a community development credit union or a minority credit union, you know, one of the great things is that we can help do credit repair, but it's going to be a pathway that we want to give people of like, okay, we've got 12 months to work through some of these issues to be able to say, but we've got a lock on this down payment assistance and it's going to be available to you when we get there, would keep people so much more engaged, because it can feel a little, I think to Chuck's point, like it can feel, you know, people can take personally the fact that they're going to have to do some work. They can feel frustrated by a long process. They can feel frustrated that maybe they're hearing a no, you know, like we need to kind of keep people feeling engaged and connected and knowing that there's going to be a benefit. And, you know, we like to talk about the down payment, but it's a little abstract until it's actually allocated. So, and oftentimes that's only at origination. So there's some way we can think about down payment assistance that, you know, enabled people to work, have it waiting for them, kind of like an IDA used to be.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think brings us back to the very beginning of the conversation when Crystal started talking about supply and how tight that is. So it's hard to find an affordable home, and knowing that you can have some power when you get into the marketplace. There was one question, this is from Ellie Pepper for Mayor Spana, whether the point of sale inspection program, whether you believe that might have discouraged or has it discouraged private equity or private investors from buying up homes that might otherwise be available for owner occupancy.
Yeah, and I don't know that it has or hasn't. I would imagine that private equity investors, the things that appeal to them are probably the things that appeal to most property owners, right? Is it in a decent neighborhood? Is it close in, walkable? Is there good infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So I would imagine that that this program, which makes, folks who are buying homes are always happy to see that this program exists. When you're selling your home, you're a little less thrilled about it because you got all this stuff you got to fix before you can sell it. But I would imagine that it probably does.
We've heard also some things about the importance of keeping people in their homes, especially sort of at this pivotal moment as we come to the end of the moratorium and we're trying to get the housing assistance funds out there and trying to sustain homeownership. That obviously makes a big difference, right? And you can't just close the gap by putting people in the front end. You also got to keep them there. We had one question. This is specifically geared towards whether MDI, credit unions, how they ensure successful ongoing, if sort of servicing practices that are different there. But I don't want to just limit it. I mean, Kathy, maybe you could speak to that quickly, but maybe some of the others are thinking about steps to take to keep people in homes and sustain homeownership as well as build new homeownership.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the servicing side of things, there's, we certainly saw during the beginning, several months of the pandemic, a lot of cases in which, which credit unions were just sort of working with borrowers around, loan forbearance, skip a pay, extending loans, grace periods, whatever they were calling it. But that's the real beauty of having a local lender that you're connected to. And I think, it's always good to keep in mind as people are thinking more and more fintech sort of solves the problems. Sometimes maybe, but there's nothing like having local lenders who can sort of work through kind of what's going on with your situation and redesign your payments to make it work. So, I think that's a big part of it. I think as we move more towards, technology on the servicing side as well, we're going to have to bake in some of that customization as well. So there's like a little bit on that end, as well as sort of making sure we're making sure systems in the long term are going to continue to be responsive to the fact that a lot of our borrowers are just going to be dealing with a lot of issues at different times and need some flexibility in the way we work together. And that's what success means when you're lending in an MDI or a CDFI credit union.
Any other thoughts? Anybody want to bring up anything?
I'm going to say something that might sound really, really elementary. But when we talk about the servicing impacts, there's a certain distrust in communities of color and financial institutions, whether it's due to the historical impediments and challenges they've had in obtaining credit and access to financial services or other things. It's the reality where it is. I would tell you though that as a lender and a banker, talk to your servicer. We have a huge servicing portfolio at Wells Fargo. I can't tell you how many thousands and thousands and thousands of calls we make daily, particularly to diverse communities, and they don't answer the phone or won't answer the phone and won't call back. It's cultural. When the bank calls, they want money. I don't have it, so I'm not going to answer. I get it. But that's an old paradigm and an old myth. The bank doesn't want to own real estate. We're not in the real estate business. We are successful when our customers are successful. And we will do everything we can to continue that path. So I just say I think it's a whole shift in mentality from, I don't want to put on my mortgage application if I'm a minority because I might not get approved. I don't want to answer the phone when the servicer calls because he's going to want money I don't have. You have to communicate with the counterparty in any event in life to have a favorable outcome. I guarantee you, none of us have been through anything successful where we didn't communicate. It just doesn't usually work out. So it's that basic. Talk to your servicer. There are so many programs available for sustainability if you just talk to your servicer.
Thank you. That's so true. We want to figure out how to get people there. I'm going to, I'll put this question out because I think it could take some rich discussion. It might very well take us to the end of Q&A. So this comes back again to Crystal's points about racially explicit programs. We have conservative courts, we have, but we also have some voices, some real changes happening in the administration at the federal level, everywhere. So I'm wondering what you think is the likelihood that the government or private industry will use more racially explicit programming to go directly to these issues that we've been talking about.
I have to say, listen, I work for an agency too. And I don't want to get sued either. But in the effort, right, of not doing that, then what you're saying is you don't want change. Some of this, you just have to get that stuff to a head. We did not get the Civil Rights Act going around fair housing and discrimination because somebody was afraid to get sued. If we're going to do this and we're going to push this, right, it requires change. It's why I say it's about courage. And no, I'm not saying we should just all go and storm the castle. But this idea that, we want some proof that, it's going to be fine if we do it. I'm here to tell you, it's not going to be fine. Because if it was going to be fine, somebody would have done it already. I mean, the reason we're here having this discussion is because it's not fine. And we think that it's important. We've got all this data and we've got to be able to stand together behind the data. But it's not the first thing you do. Maybe it's not the first thing you do, right? But it's there are things that we can do in increments. It's government and change is incremental. And so we should be pushing some of that. But at some point, we've got to look at each other and say, we've done all the incremental stuff. And now it's time to sort of do something else.
I also think there's a lot to be done in sort of unpacking systemic discrimination that exists. And I think in the credit reporting and scoring space, there's, and as we keep moving towards more and more data, we have to remind ourselves and remind others that data points are a collection of lived experiences. And when the lived experiences has been, a history of high cost, predatory lending going in, overwhelmingly to communities of color, that looking at, those are not comparable experiences to white communities that have not had high cost, predatory subprime lending problems. So, we have to really unpack sources of capital, costs of capital from this idea of how we evaluate risk in underwriting, because there are products out there that are designed for people to fail, where the lender makes more money from the failure than they do from, a quick repayment. And those products that are designed to fail end up affecting the way that that person or household is going to be evaluated in the future as far as their ability to repay on future debt. So that really has to be tackled, and we really have to figure out how do we remove as much of that bias around the sources and costs of capital from the credit box.
We got to use the tools that we have to the best of our ability. But at some point, we're going to get to a place in which we know that runs out, right? Because we didn't get to this place. Like I said, we didn't get here without explicit kinds of tools and policies and programs. And I personally don't think we're going to get past here without that. But we first got to use all the tools we have at our disposal, right? It's like, we don't necessarily, we don't need to like do the hardest thing first, right? It's like, as Kathy was saying, there are things we can do to make it better. But it may not be sort of everything that we want.
Well, thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everybody. I am supposed to make closing remarks, but I can't think of anything that I could put any better than Crystal just did. It's kind of a really great wrap up of all the things. And I appreciate everything all of you are doing in your own domains to help solve this problem. And I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.